A devastated millionaire is alone in the cemetery under the rain, crying at his wife's funeral while his 3 children travel the world spending his money. Then, a 7-year-old homeless girl approaches and offers her small patched umbrella to shield him from the rain. With heartfelt innocence, she asks, "Uncle, where are your children to comfort you?" What happens next changes everything. The rain didn't care about Arthur's pain. It fell with a cold, persistent indifference, soaking the collar of his cashmere coat and running down his face, mingling with the silent tears he could no longer hold back. The hollow thud of dirt on the polished wood of the casket was the only funeral music left, a cruel rhythm marking the definitive end of 50 years of companionship. Around him, the cemetery was a sea of grey marble and sodden grass. A heavy silence that not even the discreet groundskeepers, now retreating, dared to break. He was the only one who remained. Helena was gone, and with her, the only colour in his monochromatic world of success and wealth. He thought of his children. Marcus, in Thailand, exploring exotic beaches. Lucia, in Paris, attending high fashion shows. Richard, the youngest, at some ski resort in the Swiss Alps. All of them living adventures financed by the empire he had built, a vast fortune in business and financial investments that now seemed like a worthless pile of paper. He had sent them the news, of course. The replies were short texts, filled with broken heart emojis and promises to light a candle for Mom. No plane tickets were bought, no trips were cut short. For them, grief was an inconvenience to be delegated. Arthur felt the weight of his 65 years crash down on his shoulders. He was a man who commanded boardrooms, who moved millions with a single phone call, whose net worth was the subject of business magazines. But here, before the earth that covered his one true love, he was just a lonely old man, shivering in the rain. A failure. Money had bought everything except the essential: presence, comfort, the warmth of a hand holding his. His thoughts were a whirlwind of bitterness and regret. Why had he taught them that capital was the solution for everything? Why had he replaced his absence with expensive gifts and unrestricted access to his funds? The answer was painfully simple. It was easier than facing his own neediness, the desperate need to be loved for who he was, not for what he possessed. Helena saw him. She was the only one who saw the vulnerable man behind the billionaire. And now, her eyes were closed forever. It was then that a small movement in his peripheral vision pulled him from his stupor. From behind a stone angel that wept perpetually, a tiny figure emerged. It was a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wrapped in a threadbare coat far too big for her frail frame. In her small hands, she held an umbrella. It was no ordinary umbrella. It was a patchwork quilt of vibrant colors, mended with pieces of floral, plaid, and even polka dot fabric, as if it had been repaired with all the love and care in the world. The girl watched him for a moment, her large, serious eyes fixed on his. Then, with a hesitation that spoke of a lifetime of caution, she walked toward him, her small feet splashing in the puddles. She stopped before him, so small he had to tilt his head down to meet her gaze. Without a word, she stood on her tiptoes and raised the patchwork umbrella over his head, shielding him from the relentless rain. The gesture took his breath away. He, Arthur Belmont, the tycoon, being sheltered by a child who looked as if she had nothing. He opened his mouth to thank her, but no sound came out. The unexpected, pure kindness of the act had completely disarmed him. The girl, sensing his silence, just tightened her grip on the handle, her small face focused on the task of keeping him dry. After a long moment, she finally spoke, her voice a soft whisper almost lost in the sound of the rain. "Mister, where are your kids to comfort you?" The question, so pure and guileless, hit him with the force of a tidal wave, shattering the fragile dam that held back a lifetime of loneliness. The girl's question hung in the damp air, heavier than the rain itself. "Where are your kids?" Arthur felt as if the ground had opened up beneath him. A child, a complete stranger with a patched-up umbrella, had summarized the failure of his life in a single, innocent sentence. The facade of the multimillionaire, the ruthless businessman who had turned a small seed investment into a colossal fortune, crumbled completely. He was just an abandoned father. Swallowing hard, he tried to find his voice. What could he say that his children valued the luxury provided by their trust funds more than the comfort of their father? That they were busy spending the dollars he gave them so easily? The truth was too shameful to speak to such a pure soul. They're far away, he murmured, his voice hoarse with emotion and cold. They couldn't make it. The lie tasted bitter in his mouth. The girl seemed to accept the answer without question. Her eyes, a deep and serious brown, remained on his, full of a compassion he hadn't seen in a very long time. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, with the solemnity of someone who understands loss more than her age would suggest. Arthur finally tore his gaze from Helena's newly laid headstone and focused on the child before him. He noticed her worn-out shoes, the toes peeling away, and the sleeves of her coat that covered her small hands. She was trembling slightly, not just from the cold, but perhaps from a hunger he could barely imagine. "Thank you," he said, his voice a little steadier. "What's your name?" "Little one." She hesitated for a second before answering. "Leah, Leah," he repeated, the name sounding soft amid the rain. "And what are you doing out here, Leah, all alone in this weather?" She shrugged, a small, resigned gesture. "I like it here. It's quiet, and the big wall keeps the wind out." The cemetery wall. A shelter. Arthur's heart clenched. He, who lived in a mansion with more rooms than people, with private security and every comfort money could buy, stood before a child who sought refuge among the dead. The irony was cruel. He looked at her hands and noticed she was clutching a thin, torn plastic grocery bag. The bag seemed to hold a few misshapen bundles. "And your parents, Leah, where are they?" The question escaped before he could stop it, mirroring the one she had asked him. Her small face tightened for a brief instant, a shadow of pain passing through her eyes. "I don't have parents. Just me." The simple statement was another blow. Just her, in this vast, indifferent world. Arthur felt a wave of protectiveness so fierce it startled him. He forgot his own pain for a moment, his own loneliness, consumed by the urgency of this little girl's situation. "And what do you have there?" he asked, gesturing gently toward the bag. Leah, perhaps sensing the sincerity in his tone, loosened her grip and opened the bag for him to see. Inside, there was a rag doll with one eye missing, a storybook with a bent cover, and half a sandwich, carefully wrapped in a napkin. "Is this everything you have?" he asked, his voice cracking. Leah nodded, without a trace of self-pity. "Yes, it's all I need." That was her entire net worth. While Arthur's assets were spread across stocks, real estate, and offshore accounts, Leah's entire world fit into a flimsy plastic bag. The injustice of it suffocated him. He couldn't just give her money and walk away. That would be repeating the same mistake he made with his children. She didn't need his wealth, not in the way his children wanted it. She needed care, safety, a safe harbor. In that instant, a decision formed in his mind, clear and unshakable. He looked into the eyes of this brave, lonely child and knew what he had to do. "Leah," he said, his voice now firm with a newfound purpose. "You can't stay here. Come with me. I'll take you somewhere warm and safe, where you can have a real meal." He held out his hand, waiting. Leah looked at the outstretched hand, then at his face. Her large, unreadable eyes a whirlwind of fear, hesitation, and a fragile glimmer of hope. Arthur's hand remained extended in the cold air, a fragile bridge between two worlds. For Leah, that wrinkled, age-spotted hand represented the unknown, a frightening deviation from the survival routine she knew so well. Life on the streets had taught her to distrust kindness, to see every generous gesture as the prelude to a demand. Her large, watchful eyes studied his face, searching for any sign of falsehood, any hint of the cruelty that hid behind pleasant smiles. But what she saw was only a deep sadness, a vulnerability that mirrored her own. There was something in those tired eyes that reminded her of an abandoned puppy she had once tried to comfort. Slowly, as if afraid a sudden movement might break the spell, she placed her small, cold hand in his. Arthur's palm was warm and enveloped hers with an unexpected softness, a safe harbor in the storm. He let out a sigh of relief he didn't know he'd been holding. For the first time since Helena was gone, he felt a connection, a purpose that transcended accumulating assets and managing his vast portfolio. "Let's go," he said, his voice a little lighter. "I know a place with the best hot chocolate in the city." He led her out of the cemetery, his steps now firmer. The driver, a man named George who had worked for him for over 20 years, watched the scene from the luxury sedan parked on the street with a look of poorly concealed astonishment. Seeing his boss, the unshakable Arthur Belmont, emerge from his wife's funeral holding hands with a street child was something he never could have imagined. Without a word, George opened the rear door. The car's interior, with its soft leather seats and the faint scent of polished wood, was a universe away from Leah's world. She stopped at the door, hesitant, looking down at her muddy shoes and then at the impeccable floor mat. Arthur understood her hesitation. "Don't worry about that," he said gently. "It's just a car. What matters is that you get dry and warm." He helped her inside and sat beside her. The girl curled up in the corner, her wide eyes scanning every detail of the luxurious interior as if she had stepped into a spaceship. Arthur gave George the address of a cozy diner he and Helena used to frequent. During the drive, a comfortable silence settled between them. Leah was too busy absorbing the world passing by the window, the city lights blurred by the rain, while Arthur watched her discreetly. He found himself thinking of his own children when they were small. Had he taken them to expensive restaurants? Yes, countless times. But did he remember their faces, the joy in their eyes? The memories were vague, overshadowed by stock trades and business meetings. He had been physically present, but his mind was always elsewhere, calculating profits and interest, planning the next big investment. Looking at Leah, so small and so present, he felt the weight of decades of paternal absence. At the diner, the warmth and the aroma of coffee and fresh-baked pastries enveloped them. Arthur ordered 2 hot chocolates with extra whipped cream and a generous slice of chocolate fudge cake. Leah watched the waitress with suspicion, but relaxed a little when the steaming mug was placed in front of her. She held the mug with both hands, absorbing its warmth. Before taking a hesitant sip, a small smile, the first Arthur had seen, blossomed on her lips as the sweet, rich flavor hit her. She ate the cake with a ravenous appetite, but with a surprising delicacy, wiping the corners of her mouth with her napkin. As they ate, he began to ask gentle questions about her life, avoiding anything that might frighten her. He learned that she loved to read, though her only book was nearly falling apart, and that the ragdoll's name was Stella. He told her about Helena, about how she loved flowers and the sound of the ocean. He offered her an attentive ear, something his own children rarely received from him. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about his cash flow or the profitability of his funds. He was just there. When they finished, the rain had eased to a fine drizzle. The question of what to do next hung between them. He couldn't just drop her back at the cemetery. The thought was unbearable. "Leah," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I have a very big house with a lot of empty rooms. Would you like to spend the night there? It's warm, there's a soft bed, and I promise you'll be safe." The girl's eyes widened, a mixture of fear and longing dancing in their depths. Staying with a stranger was dangerous. Everyone knew that. But the cold of the street was a certainty, while the promise in those sad eyes felt real. She looked at the colorful umbrella she'd left beside the table, her only shield against the world. Then she looked at Arthur, the man who cried alone in the rain. Making a decision that would change her life forever, she gave a slow nod. "Just for tonight," she whispered, a fragile condition to protect her heart. Arthur smiled, a genuine smile he hadn't felt in months. "Just for tonight," he agreed. But in his heart, a seed of hope had been planted, the hope that tonight could somehow turn into forever. He knew, however, that the road ahead would not be easy. His children, when they found out, would not be pleased. The storm outside may have passed, but he sensed a much larger one was brewing on the horizon. Arthur's mansion was less a house and more a monument to his success. Situated on a hill overlooking the city, it was an imposing structure of glass and steel, surrounded by meticulously manicured gardens. To Leah, accustomed to the hardness of concrete and the indifference of alleyways, the place looked like a fairy tale castle. When George pulled the car up to the massive entrance, she shrank further into her seat, intimidated by the sheer scale of the place. Arthur, sensing her discomfort, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Don't be scared by the size," he said softly. "A house is only a home because of the people inside, and right now, that's the two of us." He led her inside, where the silence echoed in the vast marble-floored entrance hall. The walls were adorned with expensive art, and the furniture was sleek and impersonal. It was a space that exuded wealth, but lacked warmth. It was a perfect reflection of his life before Helena, and the life he feared returning to now that she was gone. He took her to the guest wing, choosing the coziest room, one that Helena had personally decorated in warm shades of peach and cream. The bed was enormous, with a fluffy duvet and a mountain of pillows. Leah stood at the doorway, awestruck, as if she didn't dare step on the plush carpet. "You can go in," Arthur encouraged her. "This is your room, for as long as you want to stay." He showed her the adjoining bathroom, with a bathtub big enough for her to swim in. He found some old clothes from a grandniece, which, though a bit large, were infinitely better than what she was wearing. While Leah took a hot bath, Arthur went to the kitchen. The housekeeper, Mrs. Davison, a sturdy woman who had been with the family for decades, watched him with narrowed eyes, full of unasked questions. "Prepare some hearty soup and a grilled cheese sandwich. Please, Mrs. Davison. For our guest," he said, preempting her. "Guest, sir?" she asked, her eyebrow arched. "Yes, her name is Leah, and she'll be staying with us for a while." Mrs. Davison's expression was a mixture of shock and disapproval, but she knew her place and went silently to carry out the order. When Leah appeared, dressed in clean clothes with her damp hair combed, she looked like a completely different child. The bath had washed away the grime and exhaustion from her face, revealing delicate features and a heart-wrenching vulnerability. She ate her soup in silence, her eyes still warily exploring her surroundings. Arthur sat with her, telling her stories about Helena, about how she loved gardening and had a laugh that could light up any room. He spoke not as a billionaire discussing his assets, but as a man sharing memories of his most precious treasure. By the end of the evening, when he took her back to her room, Leah seemed exhausted, but a small bit of the tension in her shoulders had eased. "Thank you, Mr. Arthur," she whispered, already drowsy as she snuggled under the duvet. "You're welcome, little star," he replied, using the name of her doll. He closed the door softly and stood there for a moment, a strange, warm feeling spreading through his chest. It was the feeling of being needed, not for his money, but for his care. In the days that followed, a quiet routine was established. Arthur postponed all his business meetings, ignored the calls from his stockbrokers, and dedicated his time to Leah. They explored the gardens, read her storybook countless times, and even baked cookies in the kitchen, to the continued astonishment of Mrs. Davison. Arthur discovered that Leah was intelligent and curious, absorbing everything around her with an insatiable appetite. He bought her new books and proper clothes, but was careful not to overwhelm her with excess. He didn't want to repeat the mistakes of the past. The goal wasn't to buy her affection, but to nurture it. For 1 week, the silent mansion came to life. The sound of Leah's laughter echoed through the once empty halls. Arthur felt lighter than he had in years, the pain of his loss not gone, but soothed by the vibrant presence of this little soul. However, he knew this peace was fragile, an interlude before the inevitable storm, and the storm arrived in the form of an email from his wealth manager. It was an expense report from his children's credit cards, thousands of dollars spent at luxury hotels, Michelin-starred restaurants and designer boutiques, and at the bottom of the report, a concise note. Arthur, we've noticed some unusual expenses on your personal account. Several purchases at a toy store and a children's clothing shop. Just confirming there is no fraudulent activity. Arthur stared at the email, his heart turning to ice. They would know. It was only a matter of time before his children, ever vigilant about the cash flow of their inheritance, noticed the deviation and came looking for answers. The bubble of tranquility was about to burst. The notification from the bank was the first distant thunderclap, announcing the approaching storm. Arthur felt a knot tighten in his stomach. For a week, he had lived in an idyllic refuge, a world where the only thing that mattered was choosing which story to read to Leah before bed, or deciding if they'd have chocolate or strawberry ice cream after lunch. He had allowed himself to forget the complex web of interests and expectations that defined his relationship with his children. Now, reality was pulling him back with brutal force. He knew how their minds worked, trained by years of unlimited access to his resources. Any spending not related to them would be seen not as an act of charity, but as a direct threat to their inheritance. The inheritance, to them, was not a future gift. It was a present entitlement, a resource they already considered their own. The idea that he might be squandering this money on a stranger would be, in their minds, an unforgivable betrayal. He tried to push the anxiety away, focusing on Leah. That morning, he had taken her to a small bookstore downtown, a charming place that smelled of old paper. The joy on her face when she was allowed to pick as many books as she wanted was a greater reward than any profit his stocks had ever yielded. She chose carefully, treating each book with a reverence that moved him deeply. While she was absorbed in a book about the stars, sitting on the rug in the mansion's library, Arthur's phone rang. The name on the screen made his heart race. Marcus, his eldest son. He took a deep breath, tried to compose his voice, and answered. "Hello, son. How's Thailand?" The reply was swift, without any of the usual pleasantries about the weather or the food. "Dad, what's this about charges at kids' stores? I got an alert from the bank. Are you okay? Did someone steal your card?" The concern in Marcus's voice was shallow, a thin veneer over the real question. Who was spending their money? "I'm fine, Marcus. No one stole anything. I made the purchases," Arthur replied, his voice firmer than he felt. There was a pause on the other end, heavy with suspicion. "Purchases? For who?" "We don't have any kids in the family." Arthur hesitated. He could have made an excuse, said it was for a charity, something they might reluctantly accept. But looking at Leah, so small and absorbed in her new world of knowledge, filled him with a courage he didn't know he possessed. "I'm helping a child," he said, the simplicity of the truth sounding almost revolutionary. "A little girl named Leah. She needed help. And I'm helping her." The silence that followed was more eloquent than any words. Arthur could almost hear the gears turning in Marcus's mind, calculating the financial impact of that statement. "Helping how?" Marcus asked, his voice now icy, devoid of any feigned concern. "Buying her clothes and toys." "Where did you find her?" "Dad, you have to be careful. There are a lot of grifters out there. People who take advantage of people in mourning." The insinuation was clear. His grief had made him vulnerable, senile, incapable of protecting the family fortune. The condescension in his tone made Arthur's blood boil. "I know what I'm doing, Marcus. She's just a child. A street kid." Marcus's voice was laced with contempt. "Dad, this is unacceptable. You can't just pick up anyone off the street and start throwing our money away. Lucia and Richard are going to flip when they hear we're coming back." The veiled threat in his words was unmistakable. They weren't coming back to support him, to share in his grief for their mother. They were coming back to protect their investment, to contain the damage he was causing. The call ended abruptly, leaving a heavy silence in the room. Arthur looked at Leah, who had lifted her head from her book, her big, curious eyes fixed on him, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "Is everything okay, Mr. Arthur?" she asked, her voice small and worried. He forced a smile, but he knew it was a weak disguise. "Yes, sweetheart, everything's fine." But in his heart, he felt the circle closing in. The battle for the soul of his family was about to begin, and he, for the first time, wasn't sure he had the strength to fight. The imminent arrival of his children was not the promise of comfort, but the harbinger of war. The arrival of Arthur's children was exactly as he'd predicted, not a family reunion, but a corporate takeover. They didn't arrive together, but in a calculated succession, like generals arriving to inspect a battlefield. Lucia was first, deplaning from a first-class flight from Paris, her perfectly made-up face wearing a look of rehearsed concern. She embraced him in the entrance hall, her expensive perfume enveloping him, but the hug was stiff, without warmth. Her eyes, however, weren't on him. They were scanning the vast space, as if looking for signs of disarray or, more accurately, the source of the diverted funds. Richard arrived the next day, tanned and impatient, straight from the Alps. He barely greeted his father, his attention immediately on his tablet, checking the stock market's performance as if the brief interruption to his luxury vacation was an intolerable financial loss. Marcus, the strategist, was the last to arrive, flying in from Thailand. He took command immediately, calling a family meeting in the library, a room that, until Leah's arrival, was used only to impress visitors. Leah, sensing the palpable tension, had retreated to her room, small and quiet as a mouse. Arthur had insisted she stay, but the cold, appraising presence of the siblings had frightened her. She could feel their resentment like a cold draft under the door. In the library, Arthur sat in his leather armchair, a king in his own castle who suddenly felt like a prisoner. His 3 children sat opposite him, an impromptu tribunal. "Dad, we need to talk about this situation," Marcus began, dispensing with any preamble. "We were extremely concerned when we learned you'd brought a stranger into the house, a child off the street," Lucia added, her voice tinged with faux melodrama. "Daddy, we understand you're grieving. Losing Mum was terrible for all of us, but your vulnerability is being exploited. This girl is clearly an opportunist, or she's being used by one." Arthur looked from one face to the other. He saw the poorly disguised greed in Marcus's eyes, the shallow vanity in Lucia's, and the arrogant impatience in Richard's. There wasn't an ounce of genuine concern for his well-being, only a feverish anxiety about the fate of their inheritance. "She is not an opportunist," Arthur said, his voice low but firm. "She is a child who had no one. She showed me more compassion on the day of your mother's funeral than the 3 of you combined have in the past week." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Richard scoffed, impatient. "Oh, please, Dad, compassion." She saw a rich, vulnerable old man. "It's a classic playbook. How much have you spent on her already? That money should be invested, earning interest, so not wasted on street-level charity." "It's our inheritance, Dad," Lucia cut in, her voice rising an octave. "Every dollar you spend on this girl is a dollar taken from our future, from the future of your grandchildren." The mention of his grandchildren, whom he rarely saw, was a knife twist. The conversation devolved into a coordinated attack. They accused him of being naive, of losing his mind. of dishonoring Helena's memory by replacing her so quickly. Every word was a weapon designed to make him feel guilty, incompetent and old. They weren't there to console him. They were there to control him. "We think it would be best if the girl went to a shelter," Marcus declared, as if announcing the conclusion of a business deal. "There, she'll receive professional care, and you can focus on your grief. And we can help manage your finances to ensure everything stays secure." The offer was a thinly veiled ultimatum. Give up the girl. Give up control of your assets, or face the consequences. Arthur felt a cold fury build inside him. For years, he had funded their extravagant lifestyles, their whims, their failures. He had bought their love, or at least the appearance of it. Now, they were demanding the key to the vault. "The answer is no," he said, his voice resonating with an authority they hadn't heard in a long time. "Leah stays, and this discussion is over." He stood, ending the meeting. The look on his children's faces was one of pure shock, followed by a chilling anger. They were not used to being denied. As he walked out of the library, Arthur knew he hadn't ended the discussion. He had just declared war, and he had a terrible feeling that his children, in their desperate pursuit of wealth, would not hesitate to use the cruelest tactics to win. Arthur's declaration of war in the library didn't result in an open confrontation, but something far more sinister, a campaign of psychological attrition. His children, realizing the direct approach had failed, changed tactics. They remained at the mansion, turning the once serene atmosphere into an emotional minefield. Lucia, with her flair for subtle manipulation, tried to poison Leah's mind. She would drop innocent comments in the girl's presence, talking about how wonderful orphanages could be, where children could find real families, implying that Leah's presence was only temporary, a whim of a sad old man. Richard, for his part, ignored Leah completely, treating her as if she were invisible, an unimportant piece of furniture in the vast mansion. Marcus, the most calculating, spent hours on the phone in a loud voice, discussing asset protection and competency evaluations with lawyers, words that, while Leah didn't fully understand them, carried a threatening weight. They were creating a toxic environment designed to make Leah feel unwanted and Arthur besieged in his own home. Arthur did his best to shield Leah from the veiled hostility. He spent even more time with her, creating a sanctuary within the library where they read, drew, and worked on complex jigsaw puzzles. But he wasn't immune to the pressure. Conversations with his children were tense and exhausting. They bombarded him with bank statements, reports of underperforming investments, and gloomy financial projections, all to prove that his emotional spending was jeopardizing the empire he'd built. "Dad, look at this," Marcus would say, pointing to a chart on his laptop. "The crypto market is volatile. We need liquid capital to seize opportunities, not to fund the whims of a protégé." The word protégé was spoken with a contempt that cut Arthur more than any direct insult. He felt drained, torn between the protective love he felt for Leah and the residual ache of a paternal love that refused to die, despite everything. The turning point came on a rainy evening, nearly 3 weeks after Helena's funeral. The tension in the house was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Over dinner, a heated argument erupted. Richard, frustrated by his blocked access to an investment fund to buy a new sports car, exploded. "This is ridiculous. You're suffocating us, treating us like children, while you throw money away on this intruder." The word intruder echoed in the silent dining room. Leah, who was sitting beside Arthur, flinched as if she'd been physically struck. Her eyes filled with tears, and she dropped her fork, the clatter sounding like a gunshot in the tense silence. Arthur felt a primal rage rise in his throat. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly on the marble floor. "Enough!" His voice was thunder. "You will never refer to her that way in this house again. She has shown more humanity and decency than the three of you have ever demonstrated. You're not worried about me or our assets. You're terrified that I've found something your money can't buy, genuine affection." The room fell into a shocked silence. Arthur, trembling with anger and pain, looked at his children's faces and saw only greedy strangers. The illusion he had held for decades, that his love could be bought with wire transfers and expensive gifts, finally shattered beyond repair. In that moment, a cold, hard clarity washed over him. He couldn't live like this anymore. He couldn't allow their toxicity to poison his life, and now, Leah's. He turned to Marcus. "Call my private banker tomorrow at 9 a.m. Schedule a transfer." A gleam of triumph flashed in Marcus's eyes. "A transfer? To where, Dad?" "To you," Arthur said, his voice deadly calm. "I am going to transfer a substantial sum to each of you, enough for you to live comfortably for the rest of your lives." Lucia and Richard exchanged an exultant look. They had won. But Arthur's next sentence froze them. "And in return, I want you to take your things, get out of my house, and get out of my life. All other cards will be cancelled. Access to the company funds will be revoked. You will have your money, but you will no longer have me." He took Leah's trembling hand and, without a backward glance, walked out of the dining room, leaving behind 3 stunned figures, caught between the joy of financial victory and the cold shock of a definitive abandonment. The game had changed, but the battle was far from over. Arthur's drastic decision, announced in the cold dining room, didn't bring the peace he had hoped for. On the contrary, it was like throwing gasoline on a fire. His children, after the initial shock, reacted with a fury that surpassed anything he had ever seen. The prospect of a large payout was quickly overshadowed by the terrifying idea that the main tap, the vast, ongoing cash flow from his empire, would be permanently shut off. What he offered was a severance package. What they wanted was continuous, total control. The next morning was chaos. Instead of accepting the offer, they saw it as the final proof of his mental instability. Marcus, Lucia, and Richard didn't pack their bags. Instead, they made phone calls to lawyers. Arthur heard fragments of furious conversations echoing down the halls. Emotional blackmail, undue influence, diminished cognitive capacity. They were no longer fighting for a bigger allowance. They were fighting for control of the entire fortune. Arthur felt trapped. He had underestimated the depth of their greed. His attempt to buy his freedom had only intensified their desire to imprison him. He instructed George, his loyal driver, not to allow anyone onto the property without his explicit permission, but he knew it was a temporary measure. The real battle would be fought in the courts, a public and humiliating arena. Amid this turmoil, his primary concern was Leah. The girl, with her keen sensitivity, absorbed the tension in the house like a sponge. She grew quieter, her smiles rarer. She spent long hours in her room, talking to her doll Stella, her only confidant. Arthur tried to create moments of normalcy for her, reading aloud in the garden or watching cartoons, but the shadow of his children loomed over them. The first official blow came in the form of a legal notice, delivered by a courier. It was a petition for a conservatorship hearing, requesting a psychiatric evaluation of Arthur and the appointment of Marcus as his financial guardian. The allegation was clear. He was being manipulated by an opportunistic street child, and his recent prodigality was proof of his inability to manage his own affairs and assets. Reading those words, written in cold legalese, was like a punch to the gut. His own children were trying to have him declared incompetent to take his money. The pain of the betrayal was so sharp it left him breathless. He sat in his study for hours, the letter in his hand, the weight of the world on his shoulders. How could he fight this? They would use his grief over Helena, his affection for Leah, everything against him. They would paint a picture of a senile, confused old man, and he feared the world, so quick to judge, might believe them. That night, he found Leah sitting at her bedroom window, looking out at the city lights. "Mr. Arthur," she asked softly, without turning, "am I a problem?" The question, so simple and so laden with guilt, broke his heart. He knelt beside her. "No, Leah, never. You're the best thing that's happened to me in a very long time." "But your children, they're mad because of me," she whispered. "If I go away, will they stop fighting with you?" Arthur hugged her tightly, her small, frail body trembling in his arms. "They're not mad because of you, sweetheart. They're mad because of something ugly inside of them. And you're not going anywhere. I won't let you. We're going to face this together." But as he said the words, a terrible doubt gnawed at him. Was he being selfish? By keeping her at his side, was he dragging her into a dirty, painful war? She, who had already suffered so much, deserved peace, not to be the center of a bitter family feud. The legal battle wasn't just about his assets. It was about his right to define his own family. And looking at Leah's worried face, he knew the stakes were even higher. It was about protecting this child's innocence, even if it meant risking everything he had ever built. The first significant obstacle was raised. The merciless legal machine, fueled by the greed of his own children. He would have to fight, not just for his fortune, but for his sanity and, above all, for Leah's future. The legal threat materialized faster than Arthur could have imagined. His children, with nearly limitless financial resources, ironically provided by him over the years, hired a team of aggressive, high-profile lawyers. Their strategy was clear: isolate Arthur, discredit him, and seize control of his assets before he could mount an effective defense. The second obstacle arose almost immediately. His children's lawyer filed an emergency motion to temporarily freeze his personal accounts, arguing that he posed a financial risk to himself and his estate. The judge, seeing the magnitude of the fortune involved and the allegations of elder exploitation, granted the order. Overnight, Arthur Belmont, the billionaire whose decisions moved markets, found himself with his access to his own money severely restricted. He still had the house and the staff, but every significant expenditure now had to be justified. It was a profound humiliation, a gilded cage growing smaller by the day. This financial restriction had a ripple effect on his plans for Leah. He had wanted to enroll her in a good school, hire tutors, and ensure she had everything she needed, not in terms of luxury, but of opportunity. Now, every step was a hurdle. The fight was no longer abstract. It was concrete and daily. He felt powerless, a sensation he hadn't experienced since the very beginning of his career. Amid this pressure, Arthur began his own investigation. He couldn't believe his children had reached this level of cruelty on their own. There had to be something more. He contacted a trusted private investigator, a discreet and efficient man named Bert, who had helped him with corporate matters in the past. "Bert, I want you to look into everything," Arthur said during a secret meeting in a park. "My children's finances, their associates, their habits. And I want you to find out everything you can about Leah's life before I met her, her family, anything." While Bert worked in the shadows, the pressure at home mounted. His children, now feeling in control, intensified their campaign against Leah. They treated her with an icy disdain, making her feel like a criminal in her own home. One afternoon, Arthur found Leah crying silently in the garden. Lucia had accidentally spilled juice on one of her drawings, a colorful depiction of Arthur and her holding hands, and then blamed her for the mess. It was a small, calculated cruelty designed to break the girl's spirit. Arthur confronted Lucia, but she just laughed. "Daddy, it was an accident. You're so sensitive lately. Maybe the lawyers are right about your emotional state." It was then that the fourth and most cruel twist unfolded. One night, Leah simply disappeared. Arthur searched the entire mansion, his panic growing with every empty room. Mrs. Davison, the housekeeper, found Leah's bedroom window open and her small plastic bag, which she had kept as a relic, was gone. Despair seized Arthur in a way that not even Helena's death had. It was a visceral terror, the thought of Leah, alone and frightened, back on the streets. His children feigned surprise and concern, but Arthur saw a glint of triumph in their eyes. They had done something. He confronted them, his voice hoarse with anguish. "What did you do to her?" Marcus replied, with unnerving calm. "We didn't do anything, Dad. Maybe she realized she didn't belong here and left. It's what people like her do." Arthur knew it was a lie. He stayed up all night, calling the police, shelters, anyone who might help. The police were sympathetic, but treated it as a runaway case, not a kidnapping. To them, she was just another street kid who had returned to the streets, but Arthur knew there was more to it. His children had scared her, threatened her, forced her to flee. They had removed the obstacle from their path. The mansion, which for a few weeks had become a home, was once again a silent, cold tomb. But Arthur's grief was no longer passive. It had transformed into a cold, determined fury. His children had crossed a line from which there was no return. They hadn't just attacked his money, they had attacked the heart of his new family. He looked at the legal notice on his desk, at the demand for a sanity evaluation. The battle was no longer about proving he was sane. It was about proving they were monsters. And for that, he had to find Leah. Leah's disappearance plunged Arthur into an abyss of despair and fury. The mansion, once a refuge, now felt like an oppressive prison, every hallway echoing the silence left by the girl's absence. His children maintained a facade of concern, but he saw the ill-concealed satisfaction in their eyes. They believed they had won, removing the centerpiece of his madness, but they had underestimated the depth of his resolve. Arthur channeled all his grief and rage into a single mission: find Leah and expose his children's cruelty. He intensified the search, ignoring the lawyers and the financial restrictions. He used his contacts, offered rewards, and spent days and nights with George, driving through the city, visiting shelters, soup kitchens, and every forgotten corner where a lone child might hide. It was Bert, the private investigator, who brought the first concrete lead, and with it, the first devastating major twist. He had managed to track the recent movements of one of Richard's personal security guards. The man had been seen several times near the cemetery, talking with shadowy figures from the local underworld. When pressed by Bert, one of the men admitted to being paid to scare a little girl. They hadn't harmed her physically, but they had cornered her in an alley, telling her that if she didn't disappear from the rich old man's life, terrible things would happen to him. They told her he would lose all his fortune, his house, and end up on the street because of her. They made her believe she was a curse, a danger to the only man who had shown her kindness. The psychological cruelty of the act nauseated Arthur. They hadn't just driven her away, they had poisoned her with guilt, turning her affection into a weapon against herself. As Arthur grappled with this horrific revelation, Bert delivered the second part of his investigation, a subplot that connected the past and present in a shocking way. He had discovered the identity of Leah's parents. Her father, a man named Daniel, had been a brilliant and loyal engineer at Arthur's company for over 15 years. He was one of the most promising employees, known for his integrity and dedication. But about 2 years ago, as Arthur began to delegate more responsibilities to his sons, Daniel was summarily fired. The official reason was corporate restructuring. The truth, which Bert unearthed from old emails, was far more sordid. Daniel had discovered a scheme Marcus and Richard were running, siphoning investment funds meant for research projects into their personal accounts through shell companies. Daniel had confronted them, threatening to take the matter to Arthur. To silence him, they fired him, using their influence to blacklist him throughout the industry, effectively destroying his career. A short time later, crushed by the stress and humiliation, Daniel suffered a fatal heart attack. His wife, already battling a chronic illness, passed away a few months later, leaving little Leah utterly alone. The revelation hit Arthur with the force of a hurricane. The girl he had taken in was no stranger. She was the living legacy of the loyalty his own children had betrayed and destroyed. The compassion she had offered him in the cemetery wasn't just a random act of kindness. It was an echo of her father's integrity, a man he had failed to protect. His children's greed wasn't a recent development. It was a cancer that had been growing for years, right under his nose, while he was too busy building the very empire they now pillaged. The pain morphed into a steely clarity. He was no longer fighting just for Leah or for himself. He was fighting for Daniel's memory, for justice, for every ounce of decency his sons had crushed in their pursuit of more gold, more power. The legal battle, the accusations of insanity, all of it paled before the magnitude of this betrayal. He now had a weapon, the truth, and he would use it not just to defend himself, but to dismantle the castle of lies his children had built on the ruins of a good man's life. His search for Leah now had a new sense of urgency. He needed to find her, not just to protect her, but to ask for her forgiveness. Armed with the devastating truth about Leah's father and the calculated cruelty of his children, Arthur felt a seismic shift within him. Grief gave way to an icy resolve. He was no longer the victim. He was the silent avenger of a good man's memory. His search for Leah became feverish, a race against time and the fragility of hope. He knew that every day she spent alone on the streets, terrified and carrying the weight of guilt, was doing deeper damage. He and Bert focused the search on temporary shelters on the outskirts of the city, places the police often overlooked. It was in one such place, a makeshift community center in the basement of an old church, that the second major twist materialized. There, huddled on a cot in a dim corner, was Leah. She was thinner, paler, and her large eyes, once bright with curiosity, were now dull with fear and exhaustion. A dry, persistent cough racked her small body. When she saw Arthur approaching, her reaction wasn't one of relief, but of panic. She shrank back, pulling a thin blanket up to her chin as if to hide from him. "Leah, it's me, Mr. Arthur. I found you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, kneeling beside the cot. "Please, go away," she whispered, her voice weak and hoarse. "You can't be near me. I caused trouble. I'll make you lose everything." The words his children had planted in her mind had taken deep, a poisonous root. She truly believed she was the cause of his suffering. Arthur's heart shattered. His children hadn't just driven her away, they had broken her spirit. "That's not true, Leah. None of it is true," he said, his voice desperate to reach her. "My sons lied to you. You are not a problem. You are a blessing. The only thing that matters to me now is you." But the trauma ran too deep. She shook her head, tears streaming down her grimy face. No. They said if I stayed, you'd be on the street like me. I can't let that happen. I can't." Seeing the genuine fear in her eyes, the fear of being near him because she believed her presence was a danger, was the third and most painful obstacle Arthur had faced. It was an almost insurmountable emotional barrier. How could he protect her if she was afraid of his protection? As he tried in vain to soothe Leah, his phone rang. It was his lawyer. "Arthur, bad news. They did it. The judge has granted temporary conservatorship to Marcus. They have legal control of your finances, effective immediately. The main hearing is set for next week." "I'm sorry." The news landed like an anvil. At the very moment he found Leah, he lost the power to legally and financially protect her. His sons now had total control. They could stop him from seeing Leah, have her put in an institution, use the full weight of the law against him. It felt as if he had lost on every front. And then Bert, who had accompanied him to the shelter, came over with a grim expression. "Arthur, I found one more thing. Something worse." He handed Arthur a folder. Inside were bank statements and documents proving that, and for years, Marcus and Richard had been intercepting a significant portion of the donations Arthur made to various charities, including a local orphanage. They had set up offshore accounts, redirecting millions of dollars meant for needy children to fund their own lavish lifestyles. Their greed knew no bounds. They hadn't just stolen from their father and his employees, they had stolen from the most vulnerable. This was the fourth obstacle, the final proof of his son's depravity. Arthur looked at Leah, sick and traumatized. He looked at the documents in his hands, proof of a moral and financial crime. And he looked at the notification from his lawyer, the loss of his autonomy. He was cornered, stripped of his power, facing an enemy with no scruples. It felt like the end of the line. But it was in this moment of total darkness that a spark of defiance ignited within him. They could have his money, his legal power, but they didn't have the truth. And he still had one last card to play, one final, desperate gambit. The hearing next week wouldn't be his sentencing, it would be his stage. The week leading up to the hearing was the longest and darkest of Arthur's life. With control of his finances in Marcus's hands, he felt like a prisoner in his own home. His children, exultant in their temporary legal victory, moved through the mansion like conquerors, openly discussing their plans to restructure the business and optimize the assets. They treated him with a cool condescension, like a troublesome elderly relative who needed to be managed. Yet, behind his placid facade, Arthur was meticulously preparing for the final battle. He managed to convince a social worker to allow Leah to remain under Mrs. Davison's care at the mansion, arguing that removing her again would be detrimental. Reluctantly, and on the condition of daily supervision, the social worker agreed. Leah's presence, though she was still frightened and withdrawn, was the fuel that kept Arthur going. Meanwhile, his children, believing the game was won, decided to make one final, devastating play. The third major twist came the night before the hearing. The three of them approached him in his study, their expressions carefully arranged to convey regret and filial love. "Dad," Lucia began, her voice soft and pleading, "we've been thinking. Maybe we overreacted. We were just so worried about you. We lost Mom, and the thought of losing you too, of seeing you get taken advantage of, it was too much for us." Richard, usually the most blunt, added, looking at the floor like a chastened schoolboy. "We never wanted to hurt you. We love you, Dad. We always have. Maybe we just didn't show it the right way." Marcus, the master manipulator, delivered the final blow. "We've been misunderstood. We saw you attaching yourself to this girl and we panicked. It was our twisted way of saying we were afraid of being replaced. Call this all off. Dad, give up this fight. We'll drop the petition. We can be a family again. Us, you, and we can even find a good place for the girl together." It was the ultimate emotional blackmail. They were appealing to Arthur's deepest wound, his desperate desire to be loved by his children, the paternal guilt he had carried for decades of absence. They offered him exactly what his heart had always longed to hear, the illusion of a redeemed, united family. For a terrifying moment, Arthur wavered. The promise of peace, the end of the war, the return of his children. It was an almost irresistible siren song. He looked at their faces, so familiar, and for an instant he saw the children he had once held in his arms. But then he thought of Leah, shivering on the cot in the shelter. He thought of Daniel, the loyal employee whose life they had destroyed. He thought of the millions stolen from orphaned children and the illusion shattered. What they were offering wasn't love, it was a surrender. They wanted him to become complicit in their silence, to sweep the truth under the rug in exchange for a false harmony. "It's too late for that," he said, his voice firm, the pain of the final decision hardening his heart. "I'll see you in court." The mask of regret fell from his children's faces, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. The last bridge had been burned. The day of the hearing arrived, grey and oppressive. The courtroom was filled with lawyers, clerks, and a few business reporters drawn by the dispute over such a massive fortune. Arthur sat beside his lawyer, feeling the weight of every gaze. His children sat at the opposing table, confident and impeccably dressed, the very picture of filial concern. Their lawyer began, painting a compelling picture of an aging tycoon, shattered by grief and easily manipulated, whose recent financial decisions were erratic and dangerous. They presented the statements from his purchases for Leah, the testimony of staff members instructed to report his unusual behavior. The narrative was strong and, to an outside observer, plausible. Then it was Arthur's turn to testify. He walked slowly to the witness stand, feeling every one of his 65 years. His children's lawyer began the cross-examination, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Mr. Belmont, is it true that just days after your wife's passing, you took a complete stranger, a child from the streets, into your home? Yes, that's true, Arthur answered, his voice clear. And you spent thousands of dollars on this child, buying her clothes, toys, and books. Yes, I did. Mr. Belmont, with all due respect, don't you think that is an impulsive, almost irrational decision for a man in your position and in your state of grief? The emotional climax had arrived. The room was silent, waiting for his answer. His children watched him, a smirk of victory already forming on their lips. Arthur took a deep breath. He didn't look at the lawyer or the judge. He looked directly at his children. Irrational, he began, his voice gathering strength. Let me tell you what's irrational. It's irrational to raise 3 children by giving them everything money can buy, but denying them what they needed most: boundaries, responsibility, and a present father. It's irrational to watch those children grow into adults who see a parent not as a person, but as an ATM. It's irrational to discover that those same children, to cover up their own fraud, destroyed the life of a loyal employee, a good man named Daniel. He paused, letting the name hang in the air. Marcus turned pale. And it is the purest, cruelest form of insanity for those children to threaten that man's orphaned daughter, a 7-year-old girl, and terrorize her into running away, believing her very existence was a threat to me. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, my children are not here to protect me. They are here to silence me, and I have the proof. He nodded to his lawyer, who stood and placed a thick binder of documents on the judge's bench. The truth, Your Honor, is that the only insanity in this room is greed, and it's time for it to be exposed. Arthur's testimony in the courtroom landed like a bomb, shattering the narrative his children had so carefully constructed. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of Arthur's lawyer organizing the documents for the judge. The faces of Marcus, Lucia, and Richard morphed from confident triumph to pale panic in a matter of seconds. The evidence was irrefutable. Emails detailing the conspiracy to fire Daniel, financial records of the charity fund diversions to offshore accounts, the sworn testimony from Bert the investigator and the men hired to intimidate Leah. The battle for Arthur's conservatorship instantly transformed into a public exhibition of his children's depravity. The judge, an experienced, stern man, reviewed the documents with an increasingly grim expression. The hearing was suspended, and what followed was a series of feverish, closed-door meetings. The conservatorship case was summarily dismissed. Worse for Arthur's children, the judge, citing credible evidence of criminal misconduct, ordered the district attorney's office to open a formal investigation into fraud and embezzlement. For Arthur, the victory in court was bittersweet. He had exposed the truth, protected his autonomy, and honored the memory of Daniel. But the cost was the final annihilation of his biological family. As he left the courthouse, he passed his children, who were huddled with their lawyers, their faces a mask of shock and fury. No words were exchanged. Their eyes met for a brief instant, and Arthur saw in them not remorse, but a profound resentment. He had chosen justice over blind family loyalty, and they would never forgive him for it. The relationship he had spent a lifetime trying to buy and sustain was irrevocably gone. That was his first victory, both painful and liberating. Back at the mansion, he took his first action as a free man. He sat down with his lawyers and began the gradual resolution of his financial and personal life. He willingly relinquished half of his immense fortune. Part of it was used to create a trust fund in Leah's name, guaranteeing her future, her education, and her well-being for the rest of her life. Another significant portion was donated, this time through a transparent and secure channel, to the charities his children had stolen from, with a substantial extra amount to compensate for the damages. The rest he would keep, not to accumulate, but to live a simpler, more purposeful life. He was shedding the weight of the excess wealth that had nearly suffocated him. His second and most important victory came a few weeks later, in a room far quieter and gentler than the courtroom. It was a family court judge's chambers. After a smooth process, facilitated by the social worker who had witnessed the profound bond between him and the girl, Arthur officially adopted Leah. During the small adoption hearing, Leah, who was slowly regaining her health and confidence, was asked if she wanted to say anything. She stood, holding Arthur's hand, and in a clear, steady voice that surprised everyone, she said, "Mr. Arthur didn't save me with money. He saved me with his heart. He was crying all alone, and I just had an umbrella, but he gave me a home. He taught me that family isn't where you come from, it's where you belong, and I belong with him." The tears that streamed down Arthur's face in that room were not of sorrow, but of a joy so pure and overwhelming he could barely breathe. He finally had a daughter, not by blood, but by a mutual choice of love and care. The consequences for his children were swift and severe. The criminal investigation led to formal indictments. Facing prison time, they took plea bargains, admitting guilt in exchange for reduced sentences. They lost their social standing, their credibility, and most importantly to them, access to the font of their wealth. They were forced to live on the settlement Arthur had initially given them, a fortune for most, but a pittance compared to what they'd lost. Justice, however painful, had prevailed. Arthur's final victory was not financial or legal, but deeply personal and emotional. He had rebuilt his life, not on foundations of business and profit, but on pillars of love, trust, and kindness. He was finally experiencing the authentic fatherhood he had always craved, a fatherhood that wasn't about providing, but about being present. The mansion, once a cold mausoleum, was now filled with laughter, the sound of crayons on paper, and the smell of cake baking in the oven. It was, at long last, a home. 5 weeks after that rainy day in the cemetery, the setting was the same. But the world had changed completely. A fine autumn rain was falling again, but this time there were no tears of loneliness on Arthur's face. He stood under a large, sturdy umbrella, and nestled beside him, holding his hand tightly, was Leah. She carried a small bouquet of daisies, Helena's favorite flowers. Together, they walked across the damp grass toward the polished marble headstone. The place that had been the stage for Arthur's deepest despair was now a symbol of rebirth and gratitude. He was no longer there to mourn a loss, but to celebrate a beginning. "She would have loved you, Leah," Arthur said softly, as the girl placed the flowers carefully on the grass. "She always said the greatest investment you can make isn't in the stock market, but in another person's heart." It took me a very long time to understand what she truly meant. Leah looked at the inscription on the marble. Helena Belmont, beloved wife and soulmate. And then up at Arthur's face. The profound sadness she had seen in those eyes on their first day had been replaced by a serenity and warmth that wrapped around her like the softest blanket. "I think she sent me to you," Leah whispered, with the simple wisdom of a child. "So your heart wouldn't be empty." Arthur smiled. A genuine smile that now came easily. "I think you're right, my little star. I think she sent an angel with a patched-up umbrella." They stood in silence for a while, listening to the sound of the rain, but it wasn't a heavy silence of grief. It was a silence of peace, of communion. The ache of Helena's absence was still there, but it was no longer a gaping wound. It had transformed into a sweet memory, the foundation upon which this new, unlikely family was being built. Their journey had not been easy. Arthur had learned the hardest lesson of his life, that true wealth is not measured in dollars, euros, or Bitcoin, but in the bonds of affection that weave the fabric of our lives. He, who commanded a financial empire, discovered that the greatest net worth a man can have is the ability to love and be loved authentically. He had stopped trying to buy happiness and had instead learned to cultivate it with simple gestures, reading a story at bedtime, helping with homework, listening to a child's dreams and fears. He had finally found the courage to set boundaries, not only with his biological children, but with himself, freeing himself from the desperate need for approval that had imprisoned him for so long. Leah, the girl who offered her only possession to shield a stranger from the storm, had discovered that kindness is a seed that, when planted, can blossom in the most unexpected places. She found more than a home. She found safety, love, and the promise of a future where she could just be a child without the weight of survival on her small shoulders. The patchwork umbrella, which she still kept as a treasure in her new bedroom, became the symbol of their journey. Each colorful patch represented a piece of a broken life, now stitched together with the golden threads of love and care, transformed into something beautiful and strong, capable of shielding them from any storm. As they started to walk away from the grave, hand in hand, the rain stopped, and a timid ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the water droplets on the headstones like tiny diamonds. The world felt fresh, clean, and full of promise. Arthur looked at Leah, who was smiling up at the sun, and felt a wave of gratitude so immense it nearly made him dizzy. He hadn't lost a family, he had found one. He learned that family is not an obligation defined by blood, but a daily choice, a commitment to protect, nurture, and cherish one another on sunny days and especially on rainy ones. The millionaire who wept alone in the cemetery was no more. In his place stood a father, a man who finally understood that the greatest profit in life is the love you give and receive, a treasure that no market crash can ever take away.